Everyone praised his speeches, powerful, they said, but something felt different to me. Working in the West Wing, you get used to the rhythms, the routines, and the president's speeches, while sounding like him, began to feel too perfect, too smooth, like a record playing. I work as an intern, low down, yes, but you see things, you hear things, mostly whispers, snippets, things people don't mean for you to catch, but I did, about the president's health, mutterings in hallways, hushed tones in offices. At first I paid it no mind. Illness happens, but the whispers continued. Then I noticed it, the silence. Not public silence, the appearances were all kept up. The speeches, the meetings, the press conferences, all there, but behind the scenes, in the corridors and rooms I sometimes had access to, there was a different quiet, a vacuum. I never actually encountered him speaking, never a casual word to staff, never a joke in passing, nothing, just smiles, nods, gestures, always surrounded by advisors, handlers, shielded. It struck me as odd. Presidents talk, they have to, it's the job, but this silence was absolute and prolonged. Weeks turned into months. Still, the silence persisted. I started to pay attention to the videos, the speeches. I watched them repeatedly, focusing not just on the words, but on everything else. His face, his eyes. Something was missing. The spark, maybe, the animation. It was like watching a very good actor, perfectly mimicking him, but not him. Then I started looking at older footage, past speeches, past meetings, comparing them to now. The differences were subtle, but they were there. A slight stiffness in his movements, a certain emptiness in his gaze. It was as if the lights were on, but nobody was home. My curiosity became something else, something darker. I began to actively seek out information. I started spending my breaks in the archives, dusty rooms filled with files and records. I searched for anything relating to the president's health, official reports, memos, anything at all. It wasn't easy. Access was restricted, information was guarded, but interns have their own kind of invisibility. People don't always notice you. They talk freely around you. They leave things lying around. I pieced things together bit by bit. A stray comment from a senior aide about managing expectations. A cancelled public appearance, explained away by a minor cold, but accompanied by unusual security measures at the White House. A late-night cleaning crew incident where a room was scrubbed down with unusual urgency and secrecy. The archive searches yielded fragments, coded medical reports, references to a cerebrovascular event, dates that coincided with a period of sudden presidential absence officially attributed to private matters. It was oblique, hidden behind medical jargon and redacted sections, but the pieces began to fit. I found an old personnel file for a speechwriter. It contained a detail that jumped out, a note about vocal mimicry skills. Why would a speechwriter need vocal mimicry skills? Unless they were expected to do more than just write speeches. I started searching for information on voice doubles, people who can imitate voices perfectly. I found articles, interviews, it was possible. Highly skilled individuals could replicate voices with astonishing accuracy. And then it hit me. The speeches, the recordings, the voice, it sounded like him, but it wasn't him. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening jolt. The health whispers, the silence, the strange videos, the vocal mimicry, the coded medical reports, the missing spark. He'd had a stroke, a bad one. The cerebrovascular event. It had happened over a year ago, and they had covered it up. Not just covered it up, they were maintaining a complete illusion. He was still there, in the White House, but he wasn't running the country. He was a figurehead, a puppet, controlled by who? The advisors, the handlers, a hidden circle. The horror of it began to sink in, the scale of the deception, the sheer audacity. They were fooling the entire world, and I, a low-level intern, had stumbled upon it. Fear started to creep in, a cold, sharp dread. What did they do with people who found out? The whispers in the corridors turned darker in my mind, disappeared, moved on, resigned for personal reasons. All lies, probably. I knew too much, I had seen too much, I had put the pieces together. And now I was a problem, a loose end. I started to be more careful, less visible. I stopped going to the archives. I tried to blend in, to become just another face in the crowd. But the knowledge was there, inside me, burning. I began to notice things. Subtle shifts in routine, different faces in the security details, people glancing at me, then quickly looking away. It felt like observation, like I was being watched. One evening I stayed late working on a made-up project just to have an excuse to be there. The building was nearly empty. The silence was different now. Not The president's silence, a new silence, an anticipatory silence. I went to my locker to pack up my bag. As I walked down the deserted corridor, I noticed a door slightly ajar. It was an office I'd never seen open before. Darkness spilled from the crack. Curiosity, that dangerous thing, pulled me towards it. I pushed the door open a fraction more, peered inside. The room was dimly lit by the glow of computer screens. Several figures sat in front of them, their backs to me. The air was still, charged. Then I distinctly recognized the voice. It was the president's voice, but it was coming from the computer speakers in the room. Not live, recorded. They were listening to him speak, or rather, listening to the imitation. I wanted to retreat, to close the door and walk away, but I was frozen, watching. One of the figures turned in their chair. I couldn't see their face clearly in the dimness, but I saw their eyes, cold, intent. They saw me. There was no shout, no alarm, just recognition, and then a strange, almost calm acceptance. They just kept looking at me. Another figure turned, and another, until all of them were facing me, their faces obscured by shadow, only their eyes visible, reflecting the computer light, watching. The recorded voice of the president continued to play from the speakers, words of reassurance, of strength, of leadership. Meanwhile, in the silence of that darkened office, those eyes remained fixed on me, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had seen too much. The sky was clear. The morning Air Force One vanished. One moment it blipped on the radar, soaring high. The next, nothing, just an empty space where the most protected plane in the world should have been. Panic rippled through the country. The president was on board. Days crawled by, each one a knot tightening in the national stomach. Search planes crisscrossed the ocean. Ships dredged the depths, but there was nothing, not a single sign. No debris, no oil slick, no life raft. It was as if the plane had simply ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the sky. Then it reappeared, a blip, faint but undeniable, on a forgotten radar screen in a derelict airbase. Air Force One. It was descending, landing smoothly on the cracked runway. The news spread like wildfire, a fragile spark of hope against the vast darkness of despair. A rescue team raced to the abandoned airfield, sirens screaming. They surrounded the plane, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. What had happened? Where had it been? Was the president alive? The boarding ramp extended with a hiss. The team cautiously ascended, their boots echoing in the silent cabin. It was empty, eerily, unsettlingly empty. Every seat was vacant. No flight attendants, no security detail, no Secret Service, and, most chilling of all, no president. The only item was the president's jacket lying perfectly folded on his seat. The temperature was noticeably warm. An engineer confirmed the engines had recently been running, yet there was no one anywhere. The radio crackled with white sound, a constant, irritating noise that filled the plane. The rescuers exchanged uneasy glances, the silence save for the radio static making the scene all the more disturbing. A technician examined the instruments. Everything was functional. The plane had flown itself, guided by some unknown hand. It was immaculate, untouched, except for the missing occupants. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The rescue team continued their search, their voices hushed, their steps light. Each cabin, each corridor, each compartment was empty. The lavatories were clean, the galley spotless. There wasn't a single indication of a struggle, no evidence of any living soul ever having been there. As darkness fell, the team assembled back on the runway, their faces pale in the artificial light. They looked at the silent, hulking form of Air Force One. A ghost ship returned from the abyss. The mystery was absolute. The disappearance, the reappearance, the emptiness, none of it made sense. The plane was secured, the abandoned airfield cordoned off. A team of investigators arrived, their faces grim, ready to tackle the impossible. They combed over every inch of the aircraft, searching for clues, for answers, for anything that could explain how a plane full of people could simply vanish. Days turned into weeks. The investigation yielded nothing. No fingerprints other than those of the rescue team, no trace of the president or his staff. No explanation for the plane's bizarre journey. The only sound was the ceaseless static from the radio, a constant reminder of the unanswered questions. The nation held its breath, suspended between hope and despair. Conspiracy theories bloomed, fueled by speculation and fear. The abandoned airfield became a shrine, a place of pilgrimage for those seeking answers, for those seeking closure. The plane remained there, a silent monument to the unknown. It stood on the cracked runway, bathed in the cold light of the moon. its engines forever cooled, the radio continuing playing static, a constant jarring reminder of the mystery within. Rows of monitors glowed, displaying views from cameras placed all over the White House. I watched these screens every night, part of my job as a security officer. It was late, the building quiet, most people gone home or asleep in their quarters. On one screen, something caught my eye. Corridors I knew so well appeared normal, empty. Then a figure walked into view. It was him, the president. On the screen, he was walking down a hallway on the ground floor. He moved with purpose, head up, gaze fixed directly ahead. It was odd because it was very late. Presidents usually were in bed by this hour. I checked the time stamp on the screen. Yes, very late. Maybe he was just taking a stroll, couldn't sleep. It seemed a bit strange for him to be wandering alone at this hour, but who was I to question it? I kept watching, more out of mild curiosity than alarm. The figure on the screen turned a corner, still walking with that same fixed gaze. I switched to another camera, anticipating where he would appear next. There he was, walking past the entrance to the Situation Room, still heading somewhere with purpose. I zoomed in on the image. It was definitely him. The suit, the hair, the way he moved, unmistakable. Then my phone rang. It was another security officer from the detail assigned to the president's residence. He sounded confused. He asked if I was seeing anything unusual on the cameras. I said I was watching the president walking around downstairs. There was a pause on the phone. Then he said in a lower voice that the president was in his bed. He was supposed to be asleep. He just checked. My blood ran cold. I looked back at the screen. The figure was still walking, now heading toward the West Wing. I told the officer on the phone what I was seeing. We both felt the same jolt of something not right. He said he would check again, just to be sure. He put the phone down. I stared at the monitor. The figure on screen walked and walked, never changing direction, never faltering. It was like he was on a mission to get somewhere, or maybe just walking because he had to. My phone buzzed again. It was the same officer. He was quiet for a moment, then he spoke, his voice strained. He had checked. The president was still in his bed, apparently sound asleep. He'd seen him with his own eyes. We didn't know what to make of it. A man who looked exactly like the president was walking through the White House late at night while the real president was in bed. It made no sense. We agreed to keep watching, to see what happened, to see where this figure would go. Over the next hour, we tracked the figure on the cameras. It walked all over the building, through hallways, past offices, into rooms and out again. Sometimes it would pause for a moment, just stand still in a doorway or in the middle of a corridor, and then continue walking, always with that same fixed stare, that same purposeful stride. It was disturbing to watch. It looked like him, moved like him, but it couldn't be him. Not if he was asleep upstairs. The officer on the phone called a couple more colleagues. Soon several of us were in the security room, all watching the monitors. We were silent, just staring at the screens, trying to understand what we were seeing. Each time the figure appeared on a new camera, a shiver went through the room. It was like watching a ghost, a phantom president wandering the empty halls. As the night went on, the sightings continued. Night after night, the same thing happened. Late at night, when everything was quiet, the figure would appear on the cameras, walking, always walking. Sometimes in different parts of the building, sometimes in the same areas as before. We never saw it interact with anything, never saw it change its expression, just walking. We started calling it the Walker. It was a joke, sort of, to deal with the strange, unsettling thing we were seeing. We reported it to our superiors, of course. At first, they didn't believe us. They thought it was some kind of mistake, a glitch in the system. But we showed them the footage. We showed them night after night of the Walker appearing on the screens. They became concerned. Not as scared as we were, maybe, but definitely concerned. They started an internal investigation. They checked the cameras, the systems, everything. They found nothing wrong. The footage was real. The Walker was real, in the sense that it was being recorded by the cameras. But who or what was it? Eventually it reached the ears of the president's inner circle. They were even more dismissive. They said it was nonsense, impossible. They refused to even look at the footage at first, but we persisted. We kept showing them, kept documenting the sightings. Finally, they agreed to watch. I was the one chosen to show the president the footage. I was summoned to the Oval Office. He was there with a couple of his aides. I set up the monitors, played the recordings from the past few nights. He watched in silence. At least during the initial part he did. As the figure walked across the screens, I could see his face changing, starting with disbelief, then confusion, then something darker. Anger, maybe. He watched one clip, then another, then another. The figure walking, turning corners, disappearing from one screen and reappearing on another. When the recordings finished, he exploded. He stood up, face red, shouting. He demanded to know what this was, who was playing games, who was trying to make him look foolish. He accused us of fabricating the footage, of trying to undermine him. His aides tried to calm him down, but he was furious. I tried to explain calmly that the footage was genuine, that we had checked everything, that we were just as confused as he was. It didn't matter, he wouldn't listen. He just kept shouting, demanding to know who was behind it. He ordered a full investigation, threatened to fire everyone involved if we were lying. I left the Oval Office feeling shaken, not just by his anger, but by something else. A sense of dread, a heavy feeling in the air. He was so angry, so insistent that it was fake. But we knew it wasn't. We had seen it night after night. The next day, things were different. The atmosphere in the security rooms was tense. Everyone was on edge. There were rumors flying around, whispers about the president's reaction, about the investigation he had ordered. I tried to focus on my job, on the screens, on the quiet routine of the night watch. That evening, I got a call. It was from one of my colleagues. He sounded panicked. He told me to come quickly to one of the lower-level offices, near the old Situation Room. He wouldn't say what was happening, just that I needed to get there now. I rushed down, my heart pounding. When I got to the office, there were already a couple of security officers there, looking shocked. In the center of the room, on the floor, lay the body of the officer who had called me that night, the one who had first seen the walker and phoned to ask if I was seeing it too. He was dead. No sign of struggle, no obvious injuries, just dead. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the low hum of the building's systems. We stared at the body, at each other, faces pale in the dim office light. We didn't speak and didn't need to. We all knew, without saying a word, that something terrible had happened, something connected to the walker, to the footage, to the president's anger. Later, the official report said it was a heart attack, natural causes, but we knew better. We had seen the walker, we had seen the president's rage, and now one of us was dead. The sightings of the walker continued. Night after night it walked the halls of the White House. We still watched it on the screens. But now there was a new feeling in the security room, fear, cold and sharp. We watched the walker, and we wondered what it was and what it wanted, and we wondered who would be next. The screens glowed, the figure walked, and the silence was heavy with dread. The summons arrived on a drab Tuesday. A light had gone out, they said, in the East Wing. Not just any light, but one deep within a section not used in years. My job is to keep things running, the unseen gears turning. So I gathered my tools and headed over. The East Wing always gave me the creeps, all long corridors and echoing silence. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through the high windows. My footsteps were the only sound. I consulted the repair order. Section 4B, electrical fault. Nothing specific. Finding Section 4B was like navigating a maze. Each corridor looked the same as the last, each door a lifeless slab of wood. Eventually I located the right circuit box, flicking switches, testing wires, nothing. The fault lay deeper. It must be in the fixture itself. The room in question was at the end of a particularly dark passage. The door was unmarked, the handle cold against my palm. Inside, the air was stale, stagnant. The single overhead fixture was indeed dead, the bulb shattered. I pulled out my ladder, placing it beneath the faulty light. As I worked, I noticed something odd. There was another door in the room, tucked away in a corner. I hadn't registered it before, too focused on my task. I climbed down to examine it. No handle, no hinges visible. It was simply part of the wall, yet undeniably a door. Curiosity gnawed at me. I ran my hands over the surface, searching for a latch or a seam. Then I found it. A small, almost invisible keyhole, not standard, old. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to know what was behind it. Back in my workshop, I sifted through my collection of old keys, accumulated over years of maintenance work. After trying half a dozen, one slid in. The lock clicked open. The door yielded with a groan. The room beyond was like stepping back in time. Gone was the sterile government building aesthetic. Instead, I found myself in a parlour from the 1800s. Ornate furniture, velvet drapes, and a faint scent of lavender filled the air. It was perfectly preserved, as if time itself had forgotten this place. Then I noticed the figure in the chair. It was slumped in the far corner, cloaked in shadow. As my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a corpse, dressed in a modern suit, impeccably tailored. The skin was stretched tight over the bones, the eyes sunken into hollow sockets. A macabre tableau. My breath caught in my throat. I edged slowly towards the body, heart pounding in my chest. As I got face to face, I felt a jolt of pure terror. The face, despite its decay, was familiar, too familiar. It resembled the president, not a little bit, exactly. The same sharp jawline, the same high forehead, the same everything. It was him or a ghastly twin lost to time. I stumbled back, knocking over a small table. A porcelain doll tumbled to the floor, its head snapping off. The sound echoed. I had to get out. I backed out of the room, fumbling with the key, locking the door. I didn't sleep that night. The image of the corpse, the room, the impossible resemblance burned in my mind. The next morning I made my report. I left out the part about the secret room, focusing on the electrical fault and the strange door I had unexpectedly found. I requested further investigation. Within hours, my life began to unravel. My security clearance was revoked. I was escorted from the premises, my tools confiscated. I was told I was a security risk, a potential threat. I tried to explain, to tell them about the room, about the body. No one would listen. Days turned into weeks. I was under constant surveillance, my phone tapped, my mail intercepted. I was a pariah, branded a danger to national security. I tried to understand what was happening, but the answers eluded me. Then one morning, I woke to find my bank accounts frozen. The news reported a rogue employee attempting to sabotage the White House. My picture was plastered across every screen. I was accused of espionage, of treason. I am now on the run. They are looking for me. I don't know why. All I did was fix a light. All I did was open a door. I woke up in bed that wasn't mine. The room was grand, filled with fancy furniture and portraits of serious-looking people. Sunlight streamed through huge windows, lighting up the room. A man in a dark suit stood near the door. He called me Mr. President. President? I was no president. I couldn't even remember voting, let alone running a country. My mind was a blank slate before yesterday. I tried to explain this to the man, but he just nodded, a little smile on his face, and repeated, "Of course, Mr. President." He led me through endless corridors. People bowed as I went past. Everything was happening so fast. I was given briefings on important things, signing documents and nodding at suggestions. I tried to tell them I didn't know anything, but they just smiled, those same small smiles. They acted as if I was playing some sort of game. That evening, alone in my study, a thought struck me. Perhaps there was proof somewhere, proof that I had been here longer than yesterday. I asked for security footage from the last 2 years. Hours of footage flooded the screens. There I was. Me walking, talking, making speeches. Me, the president. But I remembered nothing, not a thing. Sleep offered no escape. Dreams were blank canvases, empty rooms. I woke up more confused, more scared. I needed answers. I began searching. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, I explored the White House. I followed corridors I hadn't seen before, descended stairs that seemed to lead nowhere. One night, behind a bookshelf in the old library, I found it, a hidden door. Inside was a long, cold room. Machines beeped and whirred. Tubes ran everywhere. And then I noticed them. People. Old men attached to the machines. Their faces were familiar. I recognized them from history books, from old news footage. Presidents. All of them. Men who should have been dead for years. They were alive, but barely. Their eyes were open, staring but unseeing. Their bodies twitched. The machines kept them going, kept them... What? I moved deeper into the room. At the end, I recognized another machine awaiting its occupant. My name was already etched onto the side. My blood ran cold. A realization came over me. I wasn't the president. I was a puppet, a temporary face, a mask worn by something else, something that needed a president but didn't care who it was. Past presidents never really left office. They were kept here, their minds used. And soon I would join them. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. A presence filled the room, not a person, not a thing, but a presence that wrapped around me. I understood then that there was no escape, not ever. The role of leader needed to continue, no matter the cost. The clock showed nearly midnight as I walked down the silent corridor. Everyone else had gone home hours ago, but a pile of paperwork had kept me chained to my desk. I just needed to file these last few documents, then I could finally escape. The silence was almost deafening, only broken by the quiet buzzing of the fluorescent lights above. As I passed the president's office, I noticed a flicker of light under the door. That was odd. He had left the building before dinner, and I distinctly recall the security team confirming he was safely back at his residence. Curiosity overcoming my fatigue, I paused. Perhaps someone from the cleaning crew was still working in there. I gently pushed the door open a crack and peeked inside. There he was, the president, sat at his desk, bathed in the glow of a single desk lamp. He was still wearing the suit he had on earlier, slightly rumpled now, but he wasn't doing anything, just sat there. I pushed the door open a bit further, intending to ask if he needed anything. As I did, I got a better view of his face. His eyes were open, fixed straight ahead. His face was completely still, devoid of any expression. He didn't blink. He didn't seem to notice me standing there. It was like he was a statue, perfectly crafted to resemble the leader of the free world. A strange feeling crawled up my spine. Something was deeply out of place. I took a step into the room, my shoes making a small squeak on the polished floor. Still no reaction. He remained frozen, staring into the void. Suddenly the lights flickered. Once, twice. The buzzing grew louder, more insistent. A shiver ran down my back. Before I could consider what to do, the room plunged into darkness, complete, utter blackness. The only light source had died. A gasp escaped my lips. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. I reached out, my hand outstretched, trying to find the doorframe. Nothing. Just empty space and the unsettling feeling of being utterly alone. Then, just as suddenly as they went out, the lights flickered back on. The desk lamp, too, sprang back to life, illuminating the room, but the president's chair was empty. I stood there dumbfounded, staring at the empty space where he had been just moments before. The room was exactly as it had been, save for the missing figure. No sign of struggle, no open windows, nothing to indicate where he might have gone. I stumbled back, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? Was it just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? I knew what I had witnessed, but it defied all logic. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I needed to call security, to tell someone what I had just seen. But what would I say? How could I explain this? I spun around, desperate to leave that office. I practically ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my own desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there for a long trying to calm myself. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, an illusion fueled by stress and fatigue. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. Eventually, I managed to pull myself together enough to finish filing the remaining documents. I worked methodically, trying to focus on the task at hand and block out the image of the president's vacant stare. As soon as I was done, I grabbed my bag and practically sprinted out of the building. The night air felt cool against my skin, but it did little to ease the anxiety that gripped me. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the events in the office. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened or was about to happen. The next morning, I arrived at work with a sense of dread. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that things couldn't possibly be normal. I walked inside and headed straight for the president's office. The door was open and the president was already inside, sitting at his desk. He looked perfectly normal, if a little tired. He greeted me with a smile and asked about the progress on the documents. He acted as if nothing was wrong, like there was nothing out of the ordinary. I stood there struggling to process what I was seeing. Was I truly insane? Had I dreamt the whole thing? I stammered something about the documents being filed and then excused myself, my head spinning. I wandered through the day and a daze, trying to reconcile the events of the previous night with the reality of the present. No one mentioned anything out of the ordinary. The president went about his day as usual, attending meetings, giving speeches and shaking hands. Everything appeared to be perfectly normal. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen. I decided not to say anything to anyone. Who would believe me? I was just a staffer and they were the president. I feared that I would be dismissed as crazy or worse. So I kept silent, carrying the secret with me. The events of that night replaying in my mind. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The memory of the president's vacant stare began to fade, pushed to the back of my mind by the constant demands of my job. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. But then, one evening, I was working late again. As I walked down the corridor, I noticed the light under the president's door. The very same flicker of light that was there before. A cold dread washed over me. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I had witnessed before was about to happen again. My feet seemed rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights flickered. The president stood at the podium. A beacon of power beamed into homes nationwide. I was glued to the screen, notebook in hand, ready to jot down key points for my briefing. I worked in the White House, a small cog in a very big machine, but I took pride in my work. Then it happened. A flicker, barely perceptible, a glitch perhaps, but no ordinary one. For a split second, the president's face changed. The familiar features twisted, stretched, became something grotesque, inhuman. Then, just as quickly, it reverted. The broadcast continued, the president's speech flowing smoothly as if nothing had occurred, but I had seen it, and others had too. Social media exploded, screenshots circulated, grainy but undeniable. The official line from the White House was a technical fault, a brief visual anomaly. Most people seemed willing to accept this explanation. I wasn't. My job gave me access to archives, to records, to things the public never got to see. I started digging, searching for similar incidents, for anything that could explain what I'd witnessed. Days turned into sleepless nights, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a growing sense of dread. I began with past broadcasts, presidential addresses, interviews, even casual appearances. I watched hours of footage, fast-forwarding, rewinding frame by frame. Most of it was mundane, predictable, until I found something. A similar flicker, a brief distortion in a speech from a president from decades ago. Shorter, less pronounced, but undeniably there. My heart began to race. I kept searching. I discovered another instance, this time in a news clip from the 80s, then another from the 60s. Each time the same horrifying transformation, lasting only a fraction of a second, hidden within the noise of the broadcast. The pattern became clear. Every president, every single one. At some point, the mask would slip. I delved deeper, accessing files that were supposed to be sealed, classified beyond top secret. I discovered mentions of Project Chimera, a clandestine operation dating back to the early days of the Cold War. The documents were fragmented, heavily redacted, but the gist was terrifying. It spoke of beings, entities that had infiltrated the highest levels of power, beings that could mimic human form but not perfectly. The technical faults were not faults at all. They were moments when the disguise faltered, when the true nature of these creatures revealed itself. I realized the implications. Everything I thought I knew about my country, about the world, was a lie. We weren't being led by humans. We were being ruled by something else. Something alien, something sinister, something that had been pulling the strings for generations. I tried to tell someone. I approached a trusted colleague, showed them the evidence I had compiled. They listened patiently, nodding, their expression unreadable. The next day they were gone, transferred to another department, their files scrubbed clean. I knew I was alone. I knew I was in danger. I continued my investigation, driven by a desperate need to understand, to expose the truth. I found references to rituals, to sacrifices, to pacts made in dark places. The beings weren't merely occupying positions of power, they were feeding off it, growing stronger with each passing year. I uncovered footage of meetings, secret gatherings held in the dead of night. In the shadows, the faces of the powerful would contort, the human facade dissolving to show what truly lurked beneath. I observed their true forms, their elongated limbs, their eyes like burning coals, their skin shimmering with an unearthly sheen. I realized what the purpose of it all was. It wasn't just about control, it was about transformation. They were changing us, subtly, gradually, reshaping humanity in their image. I buried myself in the archives, determined to find a way to stop them. A weakness, anything that could give us a fighting chance. But the more I learned, the more hopeless the situation seemed. They were everywhere, in every institution, in every level of society. Then I found something different. Not a flicker, not a distortion, but a moment of control. A president, decades ago, during a particularly stressful international crisis. The pressure seemed to have intensified. The beings struggled to maintain composure. I spotted it. A concentrated effort, a pulling back of the mask, as if the entity was consciously fighting its own nature. This gave me an idea. What if it was possible to force the change, to trigger the transformation publicly, to expose them to the world. I started formulating a plan, a dangerous, desperate plan. It involved manipulating the broadcast signal during the president's upcoming address to the nation. A risky maneuver, one that could easily be traced back to me. But it was the only option I could think of. I acquired the necessary equipment, working in secret, under the cover of darkness. I studied the broadcast systems, learning how to override the safeguards, how to introduce the signal disruption at precisely the correct moment. The day of the president's address arrived. I sat in my office, my heart pounding in my chest, watching the broadcast on my computer screen. The president began to speak, his words echoing through the room. I initiated the program. A surge of energy coursed through the system. The screen flickered. The president's face began to change. This time, it wasn't a brief glitch. It was a full transformation. The skin stretched, the eyes widened, the mouth became a gaping maw filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. The creature stood there, exposed, its true form revealed to the world. Chaos erupted. The broadcast cut out, news channels went into overdrive, the internet exploded with images and videos of what had occurred. Then everything went silent. The lights in my office went out, the computer screen went blank, the door burst open. The footsteps began after the new carpets were fitted. Before that, the old ones had muffed any sound, made the place quiet as a church. But these new carpets, a practical choice they said, did nothing to hide the sound of someone walking. It was always the same. Late, very late, after everyone had gone, after the president finished with his papers and walked back upstairs to the residence. The security team checked, of course, made sure the building was locked down, safe as could be. Then the footsteps would begin. In the Oval Office, they weren't running, not quick or frantic, just a steady pace, like someone pacing back and forth across the room. The security guards positioned outside the doors would glance at each other, a question in their eyes. They couldn't go in, not unless there was a reason. And footsteps weren't a reason. The security cameras showed nothing unusual. The president's desk tidy, papers stacked, the chairs arranged just so, the flag standing straight in the corner. But the footsteps continued, night after night. Then came the security footage. Someone noticed it quite early, a detail really. The president leaving the Oval Office as usual. But then, hours later, after midnight, there he was again, on the screen, sitting at his desk, perfectly still. The strange thing was, he shouldn't have been there. He was meant to be in the residence, asleep. The team checked the logs. He hadn't been recorded going back downstairs. He had simply reappeared in the Oval Office, sitting upright in his chair. The stillness was the worst part. He didn't fidget, didn't scratch his nose, didn't blink, just sat, like a statue, for hours. Then, just before dawn, he would get up and walk out, heading back towards the residence, as if nothing had happened. The staff decided they had to wake him. They picked a night, waited until the footage showed him sitting there. One of his closest advisors and a member of the medical team went down to the Oval Office. The door was unlocked. They stepped inside. He was there, just as they had expected. Sat at his desk in the dim light. They approached him, called his name. No response. The advisor reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder and shook him gently. His head jerked up. His eyes were wide, unfocused. He blinked, then blinked again, and then his mouth opened. It wasn't a normal opening. It wasn't a yawn or a gasp. It opened wider than it should have, wider than physically possible. It stretched and stretched, revealing the dark space inside. A noise came out, not a scream, not a word, a harsh, crackling sound. Static. Like an old radio tuning between stations. It filled the room, bounced off the walls. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. His mouth closed. His eyes seemed to focus. He stared at his advisor, a confused expression on his face. He asked where he was, why they were waking him. He seemed dazed. The medical team checked him over. His vitals were normal. Everything seemed fine. Except... the next morning he didn't recall any of it. The advisor, the medical team, the noise, nothing. He carried on with his day as if everything was usual, but things weren't usual. He was different, subtly, almost imperceptibly different. He seemed more detached, less engaged. His decisions were less considered, more impulsive. He seemed to be going through the motions. The footsteps continued after that night. The footage still showed him sitting there. The staff never tried to wake him again. He finished his term, left the White House. He moved to a quiet town out in the countryside. He never spoke about his time in office. He kept to himself. Years passed. The staff moved on, joined other administrations, other jobs. They talked about it sometimes in hushed tones. The footsteps, the footage, the sound. They never understood what had happened. They never knew what he was doing there, sitting in the dark. They never knew why his mouth opened like that or where that noise came from. One of the staffers, now retired, found himself driving through that quiet country town. On a whim, he decided to drive by the house where the former president was living. He drove very slowly past the house. The windows were dark, the garden was overgrown. The place looked deserted. As he drove past, he glanced up at the top window. He wasn't sure what he expected to see, maybe just a glimpse of the former president sitting in a chair gazing out at the world. But he saw something else, something that made him slam on the brakes, something that made his blood run cold. In the window, standing perfectly still, was a figure. It looked like the former president, but it wasn't. The mouth was open.